My stepdad that night called me out of my room in the pretense of watching television with him, and he proceeded to sexually abuse me. So I told my mom what had happened that night, but really never heard another word about it. And so life just went on. And so I did what a lot of survivors do, and that is I just buried that event. What's very hard for a lot of survivors is their body tends to respond in a physiological way to those events, and there's tremendous guilt over that.
Welcome to Pure Passion. I'm Jason Graves, and I'm your host for today's program. Are you a victim of childhood sexual abuse? Do you know someone who is? Well, on today's program, we have one of this country's finest counselors in this area. Jan Frank is herself a survivor of sexual abuse and the author of the classic book, Door of Hope. And she's here to share with us the wisdom gained from her own healing, as well as from decades of counseling others who have suffered the same kinds of abuse. Jan is the wife of Don Frank, and together they've authored a book for those who are married to a survivor of sexual abuse called Unclaimed Baggage. So settle in, because there's lots of excellent counsel and advice coming your way.
I still remember at 5 years old, the day my dad packed his bags, and I was standing on the driveway with tears rolling down my face, begging my daddy not to leave. But he got in the car and drove away. And I remember thinking as a little child, if I were a good enough little girl, Daddy would come back. But he never did. My mom eventually began dating, and she married my stepfather when I was 8 years old. At the age of 10, I went to an evening service one evening at our church, and there was an evangelist there who shared that God so loved the world that he sent his son Jesus to die for my sin, and if I would ask him into my heart that he would become my Savior. And so I raised my hand in that service that night at 10 years old and asked Jesus to come into my heart. I knew even at 10 years old that that was a life-changing event. And so about 3 weeks after that event, my stepdad was at home babysitting me. My parents had had a child of their own, my half-brother, who was about 9.5 years younger than me. And my mother and sister that evening went to church to attend a mother-daughter tea. And my stepdad that night called me out of my room in the pretense of watching television with him. And he proceeded to sexually abuse me. That also was a very life-changing event that I didn't recognize really the significance of for many, many years. About a month after this occurred, my mother came to me and asked if anything had happened. I didn't know as a child that my stepfather was also abusing my older sister. And my older sister had gone to my mother, told my mom what had happened, and that's what prompted my mother's questioning of me. So I told my mom what had happened that night, but really never heard another word about it. And so life just went on. That was not the only event that occurred in my life, but that really was a pivotal experience that I never forgot. And so I did what a lot of survivors do, and that is I just buried that event. I covered up some of the deep insecurity, the confusion that often accompanies those events, the fear and the unpredictability of, is this going to happen again? I remember as a child feeling so alone in that experience, having gone to my mother and nothing changed. And so I did the best that I could to cope. And the way that I coped was just by performing. I was very dedicated in school, spent hours in my room studying, those kinds of things. But a lot of survivors of abuse find different ways to cope. My sister, who's 4 years older than me, has been an alcoholic all her adult life, and really has never dealt with the issues that resulted from our childhood. At that incident at 10, my stepdad said to me, "Don't tell your mother what has happened because she will be angry with you." So immediately there was a sense of, I've been a bad girl. And I think for a lot of people, both young boys and young girls, there's an immediate kind of secrecy that comes in, that and shame that takes place, that immediately connects with you as a person. There's something bad about me. Not just this bad thing happened to me, but I must really be bad. There's also, the confusion as a child, because what gets activated in a person's life is a whole realm of sexuality that God never intended to be activated at such a young age. That's why He put so many parameters around our sexuality to be experienced in the confines of a marriage in terms of safety and those kinds of things. So there was a lot of confusion. I think as a child too, at that time, what's very hard for a lot of survivors is their body tends to respond in a physiological way to those events, and there's tremendous guilt over that. And so over the years, as I've talked to survivors about what that means, see, our bodies do respond because that's the way they were intended. There's nothing wrong with the body, but it got activated. Those sexual responses get activated out of the context in which God intended them, and that's part of the damage that often triggers for some people promiscuity in life, of feeling as though this is my only value. As I went through my own life, by God's grace, I didn't get into drugs or alcohol, but a lot of survivors of abuse do end up getting involved in addictive behaviors to numb or anesthetize the pain. The way that I kind of worked out, I didn't know even as a teenager that those events really impacted me. I didn't really know that until I became an adult. I just was surviving. I didn't know that my drivenness to perform, my relationship addictions, I went from one relationship to another to another. I didn't realize that the promiscuity that I got involved in between 18 and 22 had anything to do with the sexual abuse. It's just what happened. And so it wasn't until later on, really, as a young adult, that God began to really expose those things and help me to see the connection between certain emotional and symptoms and even spiritual symptoms that were really related back to the abuse.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone.
Soon after the abuse at 10, I felt as a child, where was God? But as a young child, crying out to Him, because the abuse continued for several years before I moved out of my home, in praying and asking God, please don't let this happen, and yet the abuse would continue in subtle forms, really, until I moved out of my home at 21. I didn't really, as a child, feel angry at God at that time. It wasn't until later, when I really started dealing with the abuse, that I became much more aware of why did God not intervene? How is it that God lets these things happen to children? How is it that His Word says that He protects us, and yet these things are allowed to occur? And that really had, I really had to deal with those later on in life, not so much at the time, because I think at the time a child doesn't have that kind of abstract thinking to process those things. They're just surviving. I was just surviving. So it wasn't, that's part of why later on in my early 20s, after I married, everything should have been fine in my life. I got married, but about 2 years into our marriage, when our first daughter was born, the emotional storm that had been brewing in my life for years really began to rage. And it came up through 4 distinct symptoms that I tell people that God really used to get my attention. Now, I had no idea at that time, at 25 years old when I got married, that those things were not taken care of. I had even gone to my stepfather at one time and said, Dad, I want to forgive you for everything you've ever done. And he looked at me stoically and said, I don't know what you're talking about, but okay. So in my mind, having grown up in the church, old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. And I thought my history, my past had been dealt with. But 2 years into the marriage, these emotional things started to really evidence themselves in my life, and that's what got my attention. The first symptom was that of depression. Now, I had what we call a mild depression, which is called dysthymia. It wasn't such that I experienced not being functional, but I lived my life on an emotional roller coaster. I'd be up one day, down for 2, up for 3, and then down for 6, and anything could set that off. It was just a low-level feeling of sadness and kind of despair at times. The second symptom that God used to really get my attention was that of migraine headaches. I lived every week of my life with migraines and not understanding what that was about. The third symptom was that of a critical spirit. My husband, Don, no matter what Don would do, I'd find something wrong with it. And I've told audiences over the years that I had the gift of criticalness, and I shared that freely with my husband, Don. And that, along with the fourth symptom of anger. And the anger really came out when our first daughter, Heather, was born. When we brought her home from the hospital, she had a colicky stomach. And at night, when I'd get up to feed her and comfort her, that colic would keep her crying. And I remember as a young mom at 27 years old, that anger, that rage would come up, and I felt so out of control and so helpless. And at that time, I even saw visions of myself throwing my baby across the room, and I knew I was in trouble. But at that time, I had no idea that any of that was connected with my past. And so I did the only thing that I knew to do at that age. Everything should have been great in my life. I had a great husband. We loved the Lord, had a healthy child, had a nice home. I led a Bible study, and everything should have been okay, but these symptoms just began to rage. And that anger especially is the thing that got my attention, because I had enough background from being in college and majoring in psychology to know that something was wrong. So I did the only thing that I knew to do at that time, and that was to begin praying. And I just said, God, I don't know what these things are about me, but would you change them? I don't like that I'm critical with my husband. I don't like this anger and this depression. And so, God, would you change me? And nothing happened. And so I did what most of us do in that situation, is I prayed harder, I read more scripture. Still, there was no change in sight. And then I came across a verse, really, that was to change my life. And that verse is Psalm 51:6. That says, God desires truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part, He'll make us to know wisdom. And I put that on a 3x5 card and put it on my refrigerator and began to pray that every day. And I just said, Lord, I need to know truth in the inward parts of Jan Frank. God, would you help me to know wisdom? And as I began to pray that over a period of time, it was probably about 2 weeks. One morning in my devotional time, I heard the Spirit of God say to me in my heart, Jan, the wounds of your past have not been healed. Now, I had really not thought about the abuse in about 17 years. I had told my husband, Don, that some things had happened to me as a child, and just kind of brushed over those, but really we both thought that was all taken care of. But when the Spirit spoke those words to my heart, I knew exactly what God was saying, that those wounds had not been taken care of. But I didn't understand really what that meant, because I'd done everything I knew to do. I'd forgiven, I'd moved on in my life. And so I said, Lord, what else is there to do? I've done everything. I've forgiven. I've gone to my parents. All of that. What else is there to do? And at that time, God brought something back to my mind that was an experience that I had when I was 18 that became really a turning point for me as the Spirit showed me this. When I was 18, I'd gone to a dentist who discovered that I had 3 impacted wisdom teeth. And that doctor said, well, you have to have those wisdom teeth removed. I will refer you to an oral surgeon. The surgeon had me in for a consultation and said, oh, it's very clear. What will happen is you'll come in, I will put you under a general anesthetic, go in surgically, remove the teeth. You'll swell up like a chipmunk for a couple days, be in some pain, but by the end of a couple weeks, you will be fine and be back to normal. Sure enough, I went in for that surgery. It happened just as he said. I swelled up after the surgery and all was well, but into about the end of the second week, I started to experience jaw pain. And so I thought, now this is different than what he said. So I went back for a re-examination, and the surgeon looked inside my mouth and said, oh, it's very clear what's happened. You've developed what's known as a dry socket. And he explained that that's where the blood clot had dislodged itself, and in that little pocket inside my mouth that I had trapped bacteria and food particles. And the oral surgeon said, in an attempt to heal yourself, your body's covered over that wound with a superficial layer of skin, but it's trapped inside all that infectious material, and that is what is causing your pain. And I looked at him and I said, okay, we know what the problem is. What's the solution? And he said, we have to lance that wound. And he proceeded to do that, to clean out that wound. And then at the end of that appointment, he handed me a hypodermic needle and said, now, for the next 2 weeks, you are to inject that wound with saline solution 3 times a day. And that was a very painful experience. But when the Spirit of God brought that incident back to my mind, the Spirit seemed to say, Jan, so it has been with the wounds of your past. You've covered them over with a superficial layer of forgiveness and spirituality, and you've trapped inside all of the pain of a little girl who has tried desperately to heal herself. But he said to me, you have tried to heal yourself from the outside in. But when my Spirit does a work, He does a complete work, and I'm going to heal you, but this time from the inside out. Now, I didn't know what that journey would look like. I didn't know that that journey would be about a 5-year process of walking with God through some very important steps of healing. But I did know in my heart of hearts that God was honoring the desperate prayer of a young 27-year-old mother and wife who desperately wanted to love her child, love her husband, and really love her God. And so that began the journey.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone. Pure passion.
Some of the steps that were really significant. The first step is really facing what happened. And I talk about the 10 steps to recovery in my book, Door of Hope. But facing, really taking inventory is really important. Secondly, I had to recount with someone what had occurred. I had never spoken out loud the incidents of my childhood. And so going through that with a counselor, of being able to talk about the pain and the aloneness and the lack of protection of my mother. In fact, I've told audiences over the years that it wasn't just the abuse. In fact, the bigger issue as I worked through the issues in counseling was the lack of protection of my mom. Because ultimately, eventually I was a mom. I did have daughters, and so that was a very painful issue to deal with. The issue of where was God and why He didn't intervene. I went through those places of having to really assess some of the distortions that I had about God and how the abuse had really impacted my spiritual life, because I knew a lot of things in my head about God, and I believed a lot of things, but it was different with what I felt in my heart. I knew God loved me in my head, but I did not have the felt sense of God's love in my heart because there was a lot of baggage in the way of that. And so recounting, I had to go through experiencing the grief. Really, a lot of the healing for sexual abuse is about grieving through the losses, the multiple layers of losses, the loss of having appropriate love from a father, the loss of protection and safety and innocence, of being able to be a child and be vulnerable and trusting and spontaneous. All of those things get really distorted when abuse enters into a child's life. And so grieving through the losses really was layer upon layer of looking at what was lost. We have, I think, a biblical example in Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a wonderful picture of how that process, how he went out. He had a burden to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem, but he went out first and he surveyed the damage and the loss. And so for many people, whether you've been a sexual abuse survivor or grew up in an alcoholic home or whatever, we all experience losses, and we have to survey that damage before we can set about the rebuilding process. The sexual intimacy issues that develop as a result of sexual abuse are issues that take a period of time to work out. I think the major issue, it's not really about sex, it's really about trust. It's really about control. And I'm so thankful to my husband, Don, because Don, in many ways, provided the safety that I needed to begin to trust him in that area. And at times there was frustration on his part because there was damage there that he really had to bear, not because it was his fault, but part of it happened over a period of time where Don didn't demand his rights. Don didn't say, you have to do this because that is what your responsibility is as a wife. But he just began to love me through that area. Sometimes it would end up of him just listening. There were flashbacks, there was pain, there was distrust in that area, and we just had to walk it through together. I think one of the things that was so pivotal in my own healing in that area, I don't know how long we had been married, but one evening when we were starting to be intimate, I just, for some reason, I could not respond, and I'll never forget because Don put his arms around me and he said to me, Jan, you know what, honey? I plan to be with you for the next 50 years, Lord willing. And so you know what? Tonight does not matter. Let me just hug you and hold you. There was something that broke in there because there was just such unconditional love. I think what God does is when we've been sinned against relationally, He uses reparative relationships to heal us.
Perhaps the Lord has spoken to your heart today about the sexual abuse that you or a loved one has suffered as a child or teen. You know, it's no accident that you tuned in today and found our program. God wants to bring healing. He wants to restore the years that have been drowned in the pain and trauma of the past. He's God, and He can do anything if you'll open up your heart and your spirit to His Son, Jesus Christ. When we surrender our life to Him, His wisdom and power become available to us, and what has been impossible becomes possible. It was never God's will for you to be abused, and the one who abused you will answer to God Himself for what he or she has done. In the meantime, turn to Jesus for life. Turn to Him for the power to overcome. And tune in next week when we'll bring you yet another new episode designed to help sexually bound and broken people. I'm Jason Graves for Pure Passion.